I don't want my students to cheat. And part of that is because it's not good for them, and I think that's the more important part. And the other part of that is my precious ego, right? That I don't want to feel like I'm being taken advantage of. Nobody likes that. At the same time, what I think that we should be clear about is that students have tricked me before. Yeah. Students have tricked all of us before in the profession because students tend to be ahead of the cheating curve a little more than we give them credit for, whether that's more traditional forms of plagiarism, whether that's going to essay mills, paying for essays. So my apprehension is not that the individual student will trick me, because that will happen, and at the end of the day, that is the student's responsibility and not mine. Yeah. What I'm worried about is because of the power of the tool, and the tool's only going to get better, is that over the course of a generation, say, the sort of atrophy we will see in the ability to write in general. And I'm much more concerned about that.
Hi, welcome to this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today my guest is Dr. Nathan Gower. We'll be discussing the AI ChatGPT and how that might impact academic writing as well as creative writing. Dr. Gower holds an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Fiction Writing from Spalding University, and a Ph.D. in Humanities with an emphasis in Aesthetics and Creativity from the University of Louisville. His work has been published in HAD, Baltimore Review, Birmingham Arts Journal, Louisville Magazine, Louisville Review, New Southerner, Santa Fe Literary Review, Valparaiso Fiction Review, and elsewhere. He currently serves as professor of English at Campbellsville University and has served in editorial positions at the Louisville Review, Campbellsville Review, and Russell Creek Review. That's quite an extensive collection there. Thank you for joining.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here and talk. I don't get to talk about things of this nature too often, so I'm glad that our interests sort of overlap here, talking about the AI. Yeah.
Well, there's nothing like it being such a big splash that everybody on the hall is sort of what's going on.
Sure.
Before we get into talking about the AI and ChatGPT,
sure.
What sort of writer? I mean, when you do, I know you're a fiction writer for the, I guess. Sure. I don't want to say for the most part, but you do fiction writing. Do you have what got you into writing, and do you have a specific genre?
Sure. So broadly, I'm just a multidisciplinary creative writer. So I teach some sections in creative writing when I get a chance to do so. Teach screenwriting. I dabble in screenwriting and poetry, but for the most part, literary fiction is where I live. So. Actually, more accurately, it'd probably be better to say I'm an upmarket fiction writer, which in the industry, upmarket fiction is that sort of crossover space between literary fiction, which is what we think of when we think of like high art that you study, that students study in literature courses, and highly commercial fiction. So upmarket fiction would be, it sort of cross-pollinates between these audiences, sort of the academic audience and then the general reading population. So
it takes a little more brain power to read your stuff, even though it might be in a journal.
Maybe not. I mean, the goal is, I like to write for academic audiences, but I also like to write for people who just want to read, right? I mean, that's the goal. So when I publish short stories in, say, literary journals, most of those literary journals are typically circulated among people who are readers. They also write. They also dabble in that. I have a forthcoming novel that's coming out, and that is much more in that sort of crossover space where I hope it's going to appeal to a much broader audience. At least that's sort of the goal.
And 100 years from now?
Yeah,
maybe not that far.
Then it'll be studied in classrooms. Very unlikely, but yeah, hopefully some people get some enjoyment out of it.
Do you have a specific genre or?
So. Literary fiction is a genre, really. It's in sort of categories. Upmarket fiction, what upmarket fiction tends to do is take literary fiction and then it applies certain commercial appeal genres. So like the novel that is forthcoming is, at its core, it's a literary mystery. So you could call it a mystery story. There's some elements of sort of sleuthing and sort of an amateur writer detective that's trying to put together a story. So in those ways, you could call it a mystery. Some upmarket fiction lends itself more towards thrillers or fantasy even, but literary fiction is itself a genre.
Okay. Okay.
Sure.
So mystery is a sub genre. So do you like the mysteries, or does
Yeah.
that just happen to be something you?
So I'll give it a name of a fiction writer that maybe you won't know, and maybe two people in our audience will. But
Right.
somebody like Paul Auster, who is this writer who wrote famously, probably his most famous work is the New York trilogy, which is it's literary, so it's full of symbols and motifs and themes and things that you can break apart. But it's also just sort of riveting mystery. You don't know what's happening until you do. It's one of those, not exactly a whodunit, but it's a puzzle, right? So you're putting together the pieces of the puzzle.
Gotcha.
And sort of my goal as a fiction writer is, if your readership is only people who write like you don't really have much of a readership. So I want to make it engaging to as many people as possible, and I like figuring out stories, right? I mean, that's
Right,
interesting to me. So mystery is always going to be sort of a cornerstone of what I do.
Would it be an insult to use Dan Brown as an example?
Maybe. So Dan Brown is a different animal. I mean, Dan Brown's obviously hugely successful. I'll give you a
He
better.
puts a lot of history in it, though.
Absolutely,
It
yeah.
makes you almost and art, and it makes you
Yes.
sort of want to dig into it.
Yes. So Dan Brown is not. I wouldn't pick up a Dan Brown novel and love it myself. Although I can see the appeal. I'll give you an example of one that everybody who watches or listens to this will understand. So Stephen King, obviously, he's known for horror writing, but he's also a very smart, intelligent writer. He's a good literary critic. He's a good editor. And so I'm drawn to smart writing that is engaging, that I can think through, that I can't. I always think that the mark of good fiction is work that I say that when I'm done with it, it's not done with me. So I go away from it. I'm sort of thinking about it, and whether that's a genre fiction like horror with Stephen King, or if it's just completely literary like somebody like Elizabeth Strout or Celeste Ng has been in the news a lot lately. Something that it is contemplative for me, that I'm interested in, but also engaging while I read it is sort of the goal.
Did you always think of being a writer, or was that sort of something early on that you enjoyed and started setting your sights for that?
So I've always enjoyed it. I think that writing, typically writing fiction is never going to be something, unless you are, supremely lucky, is never going to be something that is your day job, so to speak, right? So even at my earliest interest, I write fiction because I feel like I have to. It's sort of it's therapeutic for me. It's the way I make sense of the world. And even, growing up as a elementary school kid, we would do little short story projects, and I had some adults who took interest to that, and I thought, well, this is something. This is something I can do that is of value that not everybody can do, and so it's just an interest that sort of snowballed from there.
Telling a story and being able to get people's attention and
I think so. And also there's sort of an old adage in fiction writing, and if I try to remember who this came from, I won't. But one writer famously said, you write the story you want to read. And so when I'm writing, my first audience, and this sounds sort of, I don't know, selfish or narcissistic, my first audience is always me. I write the story that's not being told, that I would like to read, and so I write with my sensibilities in mind. And then what I hope is, if it's well done and it's well constructed and it goes through an editorial process, it goes through an agent, it goes through an editor after that other people in the market will find interest in it too. But I'm really only sustained by writing things that I enjoy. In other words, I'll put it this way: if a writer is writing because she thinks that the market wants what she's writing, she's probably not going to be successful in that, right? A writer has to go into it thinking, I'm writing this because this is a story that's of interest to me. I want to tell it for my own reasons and because I want to read the story.
Yeah.
And then if the market's ready for that, then you've got a saleable piece of writing, I think.
It then sounds like if you're going to put so much time and energy into it, you should enjoy the process.
Yes.
I mean, okay, enjoying the process may be overreaching, but
right.
it has to mean something. Maybe that's what it has to have something for you.
Yeah.
To engage at that, to put that much into it.
I think that's fair. And one of the things that is a frequent thing that you might hear writers, I don't know if this is other professions as well, but writers frequently complain about writing. I don't know why. It's almost as if, and those writers don't seem to get a lot of work sort of out into the world. I mean, from my perspective, publication is hard. It's hard in any, whether it's in a scholarly field or in a creative field, it's hard, it's difficult. And so if you're going to put effort into something that may never get you anything professionally, right? Yeah. It may never come to fruition, then you better have something about that process that is engaging to you or that drives you, or you're setting yourself up for all kinds of failure in more ways than one, just sort of a moral dejection as well. Yeah.
Well, let's get into the ChatGPT.
Let's do it. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, just short of sort of a really quick overview, and I mean high level.
Yeah.
So
right.
so this ChatGPT, it's an AI program developed by Open A.I, and what it's done is it's taken this what they call a large language model, which is just a massive amount of text that's out there available on the web.
Sure.
And they have created a training program where they have actually taught AI how to write, and not just write, but to almost converse.
Communicate,
to
right? Back and forth. Right. Yeah,
in a way that is discursive. So it's not only that it might even say, oh, well, I don't have that information, like it did when I was looking up our bios, but it might also say, well, I'm mistaken.
Right.
Or you could say, could you tell me that more informally? Could you make it a little easier for for an everyday person? And just the ability of how they've been training this ChatGPT to be able to communicate with us in very diverse ways.
Sure.
In the very different ways. So, how do you think that this is going to impact in your day job, if you will, teaching students to write?
I wish I knew. That's the first answer. Is I wish I knew all the ways that this is going to impact us.
What's your first gut?
So my first gut reaction is that the technology, I guess it was GPT-3 or something, was the technology that goes,
previous iteration.
Right, previous iteration. My first impulse is to say that it will be the most disruptive really thing in writing pedagogy in modern history. And it may seem like an overreaction, and maybe it is. Maybe history will prove that it's really not that big of a deal. But the implications for that sort of the hive mind of the internet, right, can be harnessed to not only write new material, but also sort of provide students with new thoughts that they haven't had before by writing the sort of the discourse for them, has huge implications. And I would like to, before we go further into this discussion, I'd like to say that I don't think that all of those implications may be bad. Sure. Right? I think that the initial reaction, one that I've had and that colleagues of mine have had in our discussion, is there's always this underlying bit of, I don't know if fear is the right word, but apprehension, sort of not knowing what comes next with this sort of technology. But I do think that it can be harnessed for good as well, and so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that
Well,
too.
And maybe it shouldn't be this way, and maybe I'm just cynical.
Yeah,
But one,
sure.
in terms of writing in higher education, and maybe generally speaking in any educational sort of scenario, there's suspicion.
Of course.
You know,
yeah,
and,
right.
And so am I being, and maybe this is personal, but it's sort of like, am I being played? Like,
Yeah,
you know,
okay.
so Turnitin can find plagiarism, and that's,
Right.
I love that part, so I don't even have to.
Sure.
But occasionally come across something, and maybe it's word scrambled, or,
Right.
you know, and there's just this like, man, I don't like that. You know, there's.
Yeah, so
I don't
it's
know
a,
if y'all have
it's
that,
a
but-
feeling of a feeling like you've had one pulled over on you, right? This
Yeah.
idea that so we're talking about cheating, of course, right? So that's
Right.
the initial reaction when we talk about ChatGPT is students using this in a malevolent way, sort of to cheat, right? To
Yeah.
plagiarize in new ways that are undetectable. And of course, I'm human, so I don't want I don't want my students to cheat. And part of that is because it's not good for them, and I think that's the more important part. And the other part of that is my precious ego, right? That I don't want to feel like I'm being taken advantage of. Nobody likes that. At the same time, what I think that we should be clear about is that students have tricked me before.
Yeah.
Students have tricked all of us before in the profession because students tend to be ahead of the cheating curve a little more than we give them credit for, whether that's more traditional forms of plagiarism, whether that's going to essay mills, paying for essays.
Right.
So what I've expressed to several colleagues is that it's not so much that I'm worried about the individual student getting me, pulling one over on me.
Yeah.
What I'm more concerned about is how the widespread usage of such a powerful tool, right, where you can give it a prompt, you can give this ChatGPT a prompt or a series of prompts, or as you said, converse back and forth with it, right? So that if it doesn't answer your question the first time well, you can say, hey, well, let's try again in this way. Let's rephrase that, right?
Parameter.
So my apprehension is not that the individual student will trick me, because that will happen, and at the end of the day, that is the student's responsibility and not mine.
Yeah.
What I'm worried about is because of the power of the tool, and the tool's only going to get better, is that over the course of a generation, say, the sort of atrophy we will see in the ability to write in general. And I'm much more concerned about that from a pedagogy standpoint, from just a personal standpoint, from somebody who appreciates language and writing and rhetoric, is what the long-term implications
There's
are.
something important about the personal development of beyond just are you doing it correctly,
Right.
but as an individual, are you progressing through this and becoming better, even at logic, even at being able to communicate your thoughts, and I think that there's something that's important there, especially given our current sort of social media situation where people don't converse at all and don't really think through their thoughts or just repeat. We were talking about echo chambers earlier and that sort of thing. I think one of the other things, and I don't know how you feel about this, but personally it's a sense of fairness.
Sure.
Because you've got those students that you know are putting in the effort.
Absolutely.
You know, and they're working hard for that A, and then you get something where it's an A. And you,
sure.
And
I think you've done a little playing with the technology, right? Prompting,
right.
and I've done a little bit myself with some colleagues. And the thing that I was struck by, sort of talking about this idea of fairness and how students learn, progress through learning, is let's take a typical, say, composition course of some kind. Often, if that composition course is centered on rhetoric, persuasion, argumentation, research, right? We might start a student with some research questions and say, hey, these are some research questions we might want to engage with. And then we'll say, you shouldn't, so for instance, should the United States have congressional term limits, for instance, right? Just throwing out a topic. Well, the student would see that question. And the student would then be asked to not necessarily know what they feel about that, but then engage research to form a researched, informed opinion that they can support argumentatively, right, or through rhetoric. Well, what ChatGPT has done is it's taken out the curiosity from the student, because I can just type into ChatGPT, hey, ChatGPT bot, should the United States have congressional term limits? And now, it's not only doing my writing for me, but now it's doing my thinking for me. Right? So it's giving me answers that I'm not sure I agree with. But if I'm a malleable young person, if my mind is malleable and I'm not sure what I feel about things, and I don't have my own clear convictions, then why not go with what the AI tells me that I should think about this?
And especially if it's given in a pseudo-authoritative way.
Sure, right.
Like here, as facts, even though it's not necessarily fact. I mean, that's an opinion.
Right.
But that's one of the things that, and I think that you're really bringing home a point about how we learn and the importance of some of the learning structure that's centuries, eons old.
Sure.
And especially from the standpoint of communication.
Yeah, well, to that point, we talk about composition courses as if they are writing courses. I mean, it's in the name, composition. But anybody who teaches composition will tell you that the class is, you have to first think about what you think, right? It's a critical thinking course.
Right.
You have to know what you think. You have to engage deeply in critical thought, avoid logical fallacies, be able to recognize fallacious reasoning, right? And then once you think through those things, you're ready to finally put structure to your argument. You're ready to make that composition. And so what the threat here is that it sort of blows up that whole system. And really students also, if students are just prompting the AI, maybe they've worded their prompt in a particular way that they don't even know what they're...
So bias in the prompt.
The bias is in the prompt.
So what comes to mind is, give me 5 reasons why term limits are a good idea.
That's right. That's
or
right.
the opposite of that.
That's right.
And so without really, and so a good practice might be, and of course I don't know your field, but you were talking about how it could be a good or bad thing. That might be a good starting point to say, I just want to see what they say on one hand, on one side, and then on the other.
I hesitate to say that we know the positives yet. I think that there could be positives of such a technology. Yeah. Pedagogically speaking, it's hard for me as somebody who's ingrained in the way, I was taught a certain way how to write, how to think through prompts and how to research those prompts. And so maybe I'm blinded by my own thinking here. But in conversing with colleagues, particularly colleagues who are younger or just maybe thinking sort of on the edge of pedagogy, they're saying, there are opportunities here. There's opportunities to use this, to use a really sort of basic comparison in the same way that the calculator, lets us solve math problems. I don't think that that's an apt comparison, but I do think there could be ways in the future where we harness this kind of thing to show models of writing, for instance, to allow students to kind of play and say, okay, well, how has the ChatGPT organized this response, and how can I learn from that organization, both good and bad? Yeah. So it's so brand new. I haven't thought through how I could use it effectively. But here's what I do know is that when we have emerging tools and technologies, if we don't try to harness them for good, they will be used for bad. And so there's got to be some ways that we can say, we're not just going to be scared of the tool and try to come up with tools that will catch it. We do need to do that. I think that's true. But also, how can we help the students see that the tool can be harnessed well, and it can also be harnessed in a way that I think is detrimental to them.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
That's the
well,
kind of thing.
So one of the things, as you're mentioning, this offloading of computational and in this case, critical thinking to some degree, is that we lose that ability. and you don't hone that. Now, on the other hand, there's folks who would say, but you're also freeing yourself, memorizing and being able to do the multiplication tables, right? So if a computer can do it, why not let it? Because really you could just use that brain power for other things, more productive things, more. So there's that to bring into. So just because on one hand, we're losing the ability to do a certain thing like memorize phone numbers.
Right.
Maybe we haven't lost the ability, we just don't do it, right? We don't practice it. But, and then on the other hand, the idea is that, well, now your brain can be used for, it's computation power. What are you going to use it for?
Yeah. So I think one of the things we might be talking about here is how specialized we want writing knowledge to be, right? So I know very little about auto mechanics, very little, right? Once upon a time,
you know what the garage is at.
Right. Once upon a time, before cars got complicated, I could change my oil. But even now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take it somewhere because I know there's specialized knowledge there. In most of our fields, right, knowledge is specialized in this way. What we have to grapple with as a culture is that when this AI technology really gets to the point where it's completely disruptive, which I think we're on the cusp of that, is writing ability. And I don't just mean writing a sentence, understanding a paragraph, but a long-form essay, doing research in ways that support an argument of your own. Is this the kind of knowledge that we want to be specialized, right? Or is it important enough that we need to articulate, and I think you know which side I fall on here, but is it important enough for us to articulate to these students that your critical thought process, your life in general can be better for having this skill, right? Because as we learn how to write, again, as we've said, we learn how to think, right? Yeah. And so I think an argument has to be made at students at the youngest level that these tools have to be used in service of you learning the skills. Yeah. That we can't just relegate our knowledge to the system, or writing then becomes a super specialized skill that we just don't know how to do, that we've lost culturally. And I don't want to get to that place.
There's two things that come to mind in the past week where I've been just researching this, is that on one hand it may be helping us better understand just learning, because in a lot of ways this is a toddler. We're talking about pattern recognition and how you communicate.
Very smart toddler, but
a very smart toddler, right?
Yeah.
But it's sort of exposing pedagogy in a way that maybe helps us to better educate and maybe frame things in a way that is, while this might be a tool, helps us understand how people learn. And then, in return, helps us to do a better job at that and make them better. The other one is a writer, and I really can't remember his name. So I'm sort of overwhelming how fast this thing is taken off and how much content. But he said, when I was a teenager, I probably would have used this. When I was the B+ student in whatever school, I probably would have used this, because why not?
Right.
And he said, but now, after having been that person and matured and fallen in love with writing and communicating, he said, now I would never use it, maybe for ideas or something, maybe as a tool for, but I now respect the art and art form, if you will, of writing. And so I thought that was an interesting, both those are interesting.
But how do you get to that place, right? Yeah. Because we're on the very front end of this thing. You're much more informed than I am about AI in general.
And on a scale, we're talking about the people that really know, and then us.
Right, sure. I know very little about this. Right. And in fact, it's really just very recently come to the forefront of my, just thinking about this in general. I know that the technology has been nascent and it's been growing for a while. And so, like all things, like it's sort of happening until it happens, right? It's over time and then all at once. And I think we're right on the cusp of that all at once. And I think that if we were to revisit this conversation in a year or 2 years, I don't know. I really don't know the implications of what we're dealing with, because you made the comparison to being a toddler, right? Well, the way that these things advance or tend to happen is, I think when we get to this place, that toddler is going to mature very quickly. Right? So just the
not
way,
even dog years.
not even dog years, right? The way that this thing is sort of already changing the way that we think about our relationship to writing, to prompting, to communication in general. What does that look like 5 years from now? How much exponential growth has this had? Even in I'm sort of, when I play with this, with the prompting, certain things I'll say, well, these don't, I'm not scared of this thing yet, because it has, it mixes up images and writes things that are kind of contradictory in the same sentence. Well, it's learning, and it's going to continue to learn based on data that it gathers, and who knows? And
it's being trained. I mean, that's the thing. It's not learning from its own self, really. It's not recursive learning. It's learning from humans saying, whether you're as it gives you something, there's always the little up or down, that's a little bit of it, but there's human intervention in the back end from both sides. So when I say, so how would I respond to that? How was the intent? What was the question? And was it, so they're training this to mimic that conversational style. And I think that's why people are so amazed with it. It's like, you can't, it's such a diverse sort of interaction and communication.
I wonder, though, at some point, when does it outgrow that sort of need for human learning, right? Or does it? I don't know. I don't think we know yet, because we don't know what the next step in this is. We know the what is it, Open A.I? So we know what Open A.I is intending for this right now. But what other programs are being developed? What we don't know. We don't know. So.
And what is happening is, after they tested it and it was running well, now they've opened it up, and so the exponential learning that's going on, because you've got people like you and I who are just asking it questions and just messing with it, and so where it was a month ago, whenever it was released, a little over a month, so less than 2 months, less than 60 days. I can't even imagine how much further they are beyond that, and so. Maybe we can, as a society, anybody who's messed with it can get a little kickback once they go into their $60 billion offering.
That's right. Well, but to gauge the level of sort of the climate around this, you mentioned how recently it was released. As soon as it was, I was getting texts from people that are in the field, right? Both of course, in creative writing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also people to teach composition, and people are interested. And there's a moment here, right, where people are really they don't know what to do. They don't know what's next. And of course, you mentioned Turnitin or any of these plagiarism detection sort of entities. So it could be Turnitin or SafeAssign or a number of them. They're figuring out what to do. They're working on it.
I saw a message from Turnitin that said they've got something.
Right, which is, again, the messaging right now is very reactive, and I think that that's normal, and it's a fear-based reaction. Eventually, I think that the conversation needs to turn to how are these tools going to be harnessed positively, and I don't know, I can't articulate what that will look like yet, but I do think that there will be a turn in that.
But we can't turn away.
No, you can't. You have to run, because it's not going away. There are enough people who are interested in this technology, both financially, of course, but also in just the massive things that it could do for people, that certainly it's not going away, and we can't run from it. You've got to understand it, and you've got to understand how it's going to affect me personally, but also my students and the people I'm responsible for. So those are things that we'll deal with.
Right. Well, I think
when
the analogy of it being a tool,
Sure.
and we can say the same thing about a hatchet, let's say,
Yeah, of course.
or
Right.
just about any other tool where it's there's the possibility of malevolence or benevolence.
Sure.
And, and so I'm really I'm encouraged by that. The other thing too is there's people who say, this next year is going to be a game changer. It's going to, and then there's people who are saying, well, but really it's still immature. It's not getting us to the general intelligence because it's using a static data set.
Sure.
And it's, to the degree that it's actually adding to that, my guess is it's adding answers, like things that were good. So now we don't have to try to figure it out. We'll just go pick that up when somebody asks the same. So caching that answer. But there are folks who, and I've seen a couple of people that online who have said, well, it's still really early days. And the new will wear off of it. And people will figure out how to use it responsibly, and that really it's just a matter of it being a pattern. That the pattern there's only so much they can do in the current state with the pattern, and with it not being dynamic, like real time. Let me ask a question and it'll give us stuff from today, as recent as possible. So I think those are some things that that should, because we don't know.
We don't. There's no way to predict this. But I would say I had a little bit of that just conversing on social media, getting people's perspectives and ideas. And I did have a little pushback from people who said, it's, this stuff is, just look at it, look at the errors that it's producing. This isn't, that people are blowing this out of proportion. But it is early stages, but how long does it stay nascent? Those are questions, of course, that I can't answer. I do know that I've seen enough of it to know that, students, maybe not essays right now, but just thinking about students who write online discussion forum posts, things that don't require a lot of heavy lifting, things that are just basically, what is your thought process on this, or what do you know about this? Well, those, if I'm a student, and if I'm pressed for time and I'm stressed and I'm anxious, and I see this thing right here that I can just put the prompt in, and it gives me an answer that may not be perfect, but it's passable, and it looks like something I might write, because guess what? I'm not a perfect writer.
And I could beat the folks at pizza.
That's right.
For pizza.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I do think, I've seen it this semester already with students using this technology to turn in assignments. It's already a thing. And so it's here.
Now, how did you spot that?
So, well, in this particular instance, and I won't give specifics of this case, but in this particular instance, there were a few red flags, and maybe these are things that we'll have to consider. The first was the student used research where research wasn't required. And so immediately I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. We don't have a lot of students.
Of those,
some maybe, right? I was one of those. But and the second thing that cued me in to this was they were citing some database articles that had a DOI attached to them, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting. But they weren't citing those database articles from our Campbellsville University library holdings. So they weren't citing it as part of our databases.
Where they could actually get it. It was
where they could get it. And so I thought, my question to them, and I didn't to this student, I didn't accuse immediately. I just wanted to have a conversation. And the conversation basically went like this. Well, I wondered what your thought process was here in using research where none was required. And I also wondered whether you got these resources from our databases, and if you did, why they weren't cited from our databases. And if you didn't, then where did you access them? And the conversation basically ended there because the student said, I think I misunderstood the assignment, and he did it over. And so there, we could talk about consequences of that, but I don't think that's important for our discussion. I just think that that's the other thing that, from a pedagogy standpoint, is we've got to figure out what we can do to build in safeguards that don't rely on necessarily a hard and fast yes or no, this is generated by ChatGPT or AI software or not, because those things may or may not be reliable. And so what can we do in the classroom to build in checkpoints in the students' writing to make sure they understand their own research? Those are conversations we need to be having.
Yeah, and I think participatory learning, and they've been talking about this for a couple of decades now, and longer, really.
Right.
And it does take a lot of time within the classroom structure to build in participation, to build in whether it's writing or just collaborative sort of creation of something. But you get to see how the student's thinking.
Sure.
Right? You get to see, and you get to be explicit about your own thinking.
Sure.
And so I think maybe that could be a positive too, where we're doing less homework maybe, and more. But I know when you have, and I know writing has to, just hearing on the hall, how much time it takes to work with one student, Some not as much, it's like anything else. Some not as much, some are going to take a lot of your time, but to be able to do that consistently in an hour and 15-minute session, that's going to be difficult.
Well, I'll say this: if we're fortunately for here at the university where I teach, and also many universities, composition sections, writing specific sections of classes are typically kept reasonably small. Now we could argue about what that means, but for our purposes, I can build in things in my class because I have a few enough students where I can make sure that I'm meeting with them individually about their research. Where'd you find your research? Talk to me about it. Orally, I want to hear you talk about it. Do you understand it? Talk to me about the structure of your essay. Show me your thesis, and let's build an outline. I can do these things. What I'm concerned with are the implications of courses that are outside of that kind of structure. Courses that aren't teaching writing, for instance.
My midterm research paper.
That's right, a midterm research paper. I was talking to a colleague who's in a different discipline. And he said, oh, well, first of all, my job just got a lot harder, but also I'm not really trained to do this. This isn't part of my discipline. What my discipline is to talk through the language, the terminology, and the research style and methods of this discipline. And then my trust is the student is independently going to do those things. And if you have a large section, say a large lecture session that in some other universities that papers are being graded largely by TAs because there's lots of papers being produced. Well, as a professor, you don't have that you don't have that luxury of meeting with the student that way. So what are other ways, right, that we can make sure that we're building in this framework where students aren't as tempted, that they know that there's going to be this framework that will catch them. Those are conversations that are happening everywhere, I think, right now.
Well, it certainly, from an academic standpoint, is having a lot of conversations, and I feel that it's going to change the game a little bit.
Oh, sure.
And one of the things that I say quite often is with artificial intelligence is it's a paradigm shift. When you had typewriters and went to computers for word processing, that was an advancing in technology.
Sure.
And so it was just a matter of learning the new tool and how it functions and how to use it. This is different. This is a new way of conceiving creativity and production, for lack, and competence.
Sure.
I mean, it's certainly again what I would say be a paradigm shift.
It's a paradigm shift. It's certainly disruptive. I mean, anytime you have a disruption usually we talk about disruption in markets or industry, but this is disruptive to the way that I've always conceptualized the teaching of writing, and that students have always thought of themselves in relation to writing. And so the implications of that, again, they're going to be long lasting, and they're going to be things that we just have to address as they come up. Sure.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank you for joining us on this edition of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Make sure to click the subscribe button below and share and like this to help get the word out. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate
Yeah,
it. We'd love to
thanks a
have you
lot.
back at
Yeah,
some point.
appreciate it. That was fun.